I will have learned German properly. Ich habe versagt.
Connect generations. So when I first got the news that he's coming to Germany, I told my dad because I think I love reading because my dad loves reading and he loves books and he loves fantasy books. And I know that he loves those kind of fantasy books that you write. And I told him, oh, Ted Williams is coming to Germany and he finished The Last King of Osten Ard. Do you know Ted Williams? And he went straight to his office and sent me pictures from Shadow March, Otherland, The Last King of Osten Ard. And he told me, oh, I loved Otherland. It's so good. And that was the moment I thought, oh, maybe I should start reading science fiction because I've never read science fiction. And my dad told me Otherland is so good. And I think your books connect generations. And I think that's so fantastic. And we love that you're here in Germany. You're one of your best friends, and she's one of your really, really good friends. And she was one of the first readers of The Last King of the Osten Ard series after you wired your agent publisher. And that's why she told me you called her godmother of The Last King of Osten Ard, which is like a fantastic title to have.
Favorite.
And yeah, you're going to talk about all things Osten Ard and Ted Williams. So a warm welcome to Ted and Ylva.
Because Ylva and really three other main people knew the first series of Osten Ard books so much better than I did because I hadn't read the bloody things in 30 years. You know, I was writing other books. And so when I started this, and I was constantly emailing Ylva and our friend Ron, but mostly Ylva and Ron and a couple of others, I was always saying, you know, I want to have this guy from the first set of books and have him show up in these books. And they would tell me, then you shouldn't have killed him in the first series of books. So on the one hand, I was so grateful to them. And on the other hand, they constantly frustrating me. One last thing I wanted to say before we start. I think I first came to Frankfurt, or at least first came to tour, but it probably included Frankfurt back in about 1998. And I have gotten to see several people tonight that I literally first saw back then who are still working for Klett, which I think is an amazing sign of, you know, the strength of the company that they're still working here. But I also wanted to remind people that the first time I was at Frankfurt and meeting various people from the publishing company and others, and I said at that time, very bravely, I said, I know I'm ashamed of my German. I'm ashamed that I have to make everyone speak English when I'm around. I promise you by the next time, this is 1980, by the next time I am back in Frankfurt next year or whatever it was, I will have learned German properly. Ich habe versagt. Not for lack of love of coming to Germany, not for lack of extreme affection and gratitude to all the people I've worked with here, who, as I said, there are people here who I was working with back then, Matthias, Katharina, and many others, Verena, Stefan, of course, who I have been working with for decades, or did work with for years and years, starting decades ago. So anyway, I just wanted to say that it's been a really weird last 6 months because I went to my 50th high school reunion this summer, and here I am, you know, this is the 30-something year, you know, reunion of being back in Frankfurt. So I'm feeling very old.
Right. We were supposed to talk about a writing career, about your writing career, And I'd love to start with the story how you sold your first book, because I think it's hilarious and it's a good start. So tell us about you selling Testreader to Dawn.
Yes, I actually, I knew nothing about publishing or really, I mean, I read science fiction and fantasy all the time. I was very much a reader, but I had never gone to a convention. I was not part of fandom, as it's called. I didn't know really anything. So I just sort of picked publishers at random who I knew did the kind of work that I thought I was going to be trying or had just done with my first book. And I sent it to the first one, and they sent it back to me literally the same day they received it. And I know this because back in those days when we used actual paper manuscripts, you would put a little 3x5 card in them and with your own address on it and a stamp. And basically that was, it said, we have received your manuscript, because otherwise, it might be lost in the mail and you would never know. So I got the manuscript back before that card. So that was an indicator that they did not spend a lot of time poring over my manuscript. That's another story there I could tell sometime, but I won't tonight. Because what Ylva's talking about is the second publisher, Daw Books. I sent my manuscript to. I did not realize at the time that they were a comparatively small publishing company attached to a big distributing company, and a family business, essentially. So I sent that to them, and I was, of course, kind of had been taught that these things you find out about right away. Uh, and I didn't hear anything. And I didn't hear anything. And I didn't hear anything. And several months went by. And I knew they had it because they had also sent the card back, just not the manuscript yet. So I was beginning to get a little nervous. And I didn't know, I didn't have an agent, I didn't have anything. So I had no way to find out what was going on except to contact them directly. But I already had an inkling that publishers probably didn't want to hear from writers who had submitted an unsolicited manuscript, that would not make them clap their hands with joy. Oh, hooray, he's on the phone. No. So I had to think of a way to find out what was going on with my manuscript. So I wrote them a long and pitiful letter about how I had been storing my other copy of the manuscript, because you also weren't supposed to make multiple copies. You only sent one to a publisher, waited, and then sent it to another. So I sent them this very sad letter about how I had been storing my other copy, my only other copy of the manuscript, in the basement of my house, and that we had had terrible flooding, and my manuscript had been destroyed. Well, fortunately, my publishers are New Yorkers, and they did not realize that, first of all, nobody has a basement in California. We just don't. And we were in the middle of an 11-year drought, so I don't know how they missed that. But the fact was that I said, so could you please copy the manuscript for me? And I'm figuring at least that way they have to find it, because it's probably propping up a table with a short leg, And so, they'll have to go look for it, and at least they'll be reminded of it. I didn't know that they were actually reading it at the time, just that they were slow because there weren't many people in the office. Anyway, so I eventually got a photocopy, and some 3-4 months later, I got a letter from Donald Walheim, who at the time was still the publisher. And, he said, basically, we want to take your book. So about a year later, I met Peter, who is Betsy Walheim's husband and a wonderful human being, one of my favorite people in the world. And he confessed to me at the American Booksellers Association in San Francisco when I was meeting the Daw people for the first time. He told me, I'm really glad you wrote to us, because I made the photocopy for you. He said the only thing that was a problem was the damn thing was like, there was no feed on the copying machine. So I had to do each page. And he's telling me this, and they're just like, parts of me are shriveling up inside. And I'm thinking to myself, I literally thought this to myself, I hope I can be friends with Peter long enough to someday admit to him what I did. And I finally did about 22 years later. I don't remember exactly, but it was a long time. It was a long time. And it was only when I was extremely secure in our friendship that I finally told him. And he just shook his head in disgust. But bless him, he did not hold it against me, as far as I know. Yeah, I mean, I still go to visit them regularly, and I always wake up in the morning. So he has not put a pillow over my head and done a one flew over the cuckoo's nest on me. So I'm guessing he really did forgive me. He is a good person. Anyway, so and then they are still my American publishers. This is now 40 years on. So I that weird little trick may have filled me with
Paid
guilt.
off mightily.
And as I said, they are friends, they are lovely people. We still get along brilliantly, so anyway, there you go.
Earlier, we were talking about Tolkien translations, and funnily enough, just the other day, we were talking about your translations to German, and you talked, you told me very interesting things about the
Translator of Otherland.
Yeah, exactly. I would like you to repeat that a bit because it was mighty interesting.
Well, now first of all, the first credit has to go to Frau Ulrike Killer, who was my first publisher, and in fact was the person who brought me to Klett, and who was a wonderful human being, and first introduced herself to me by taking me for a walk in Stuttgart, and turning a corner, and she had planned this, and we turned a corner, and there was a gigantic pterodactyl model, full life size, about 25, 30 feet wingspan, being lifted into a museum upper floor on a crane. And she had, let's go for a walk, Tad, she said. My first day in Stuttgart. So Ulrika was brilliant. But anyway, she found, and because for a lot of reasons, the Otherland books were a very complicated translation. They were not by any means a normal translation. I won't go into all the details, but there's an immense amount of wordplay, but there's also a lot of cultural play with things like fairy tales and things like that, that Hans Ulrich Möhring, or Hum, as he's known to his friends, wanted to make sure that these things would resonate. And he knew that a lot of because without going into too much detail, in the final volume in particular, many of the events are happening in a virtual world that has been created by a being who is essentially has been isolated away from humanity, but it has interacted with other children in the past. And as a result, it has these versions of nursery rhymes and the characters of nursery rhymes that it's made, but misheard and misunderstood. And as a result, it's this crazy hodgepodge of misunderstood, essentially English and American nursery rhymes and folk tales. And whom Hans Ulrich wanted to make it more accessible to a German audience. So he actually not only did these amazingly intricate translations, but he had to rewrite bits of it into Märchen that were more familiar to German readers, which is, above and beyond the call for a lot of translators. But even more than that, I had more conversations with whom about the Otherland books than I have had with all the translators I have ever had during the course of my pitifully long career. And, he would catch things that we had already published in English, so they'd already been through the entire editorial cycle. And he would say, isn't this guy actually, doesn't he only have one leg? So how is he doing that? And I go, oh, shit. How did I do 4 drafts of that and not notice this guy, the winning an ass kicking contest with only one leg? But that was the level of the incredibly granular level that he worked. But at the same time, he was he is, I assume. I haven't talked to him lately, but he is a scholar. He was most well known for translating William Blake into German. So I was highly inclined to go with his suggestions where he made them, because I sure as hell couldn't translate William Blake into German. I couldn't translate Dr. Seuss into German. So, how do you say the cat in the hat comes back?
I don't know.
Yeah, see?
Yeah.
Completely different culture. So anyway, and that was it. It was an amazing experience. And it was, Ulrika who said, I will go far afield. I will not pick a normal science fiction translator that everybody knows. I will pick this guy whose specialty is poets and et cetera, because I think he will do justice to the complicated language and wordplay and all that stuff. So I was incredibly grateful for that. And to whatever extent that Otherland has meant something to people in Germany, who read it in German, he deserves a huge amount of the credit for that.
Okay, maybe now we come to the books we're here for. The Last King of Osten Ard is now translated into German, and the last book is out and published. And that's now where I come in, because I was extremely fortunate to be one of your first readers and correspondents and critiques. So, but maybe you started how it was for you to return. I remember how you told me and others that you would return, and that your wife had pestered you for ages in doing so. Like, why don't you write more Osten Ard? It sells so well. And you were always like, yeah, well, but I can't. I do not have a story, and I'm not a franchise, and I need an inspiration. And then you got the inspiration. How?
I think you just answered the question, didn't you? No. My wife, Deborah Beale, is an extremely savvy publisher in her own right. She started 2 different science fiction lists in England and helmed them both for quite some time, and is the reason that I came to Klett in the first place. But that's a long story. I don't know if we'll have time to tell it. But anyway, so for a long time, Deborah would say it wasn't. Deborah certainly was conscious of the money issue. There's no question about that. She is a businesswoman. But the way she would always pitch it to me, knowing my sympathies and weaknesses, she would always say, oh, I hear from so many readers that they really want another, which may have been completely false. I don't know. She may have just made that up, because again, savvy businesswoman. But I would always say, I'm never going to go back to anything that I've already created, because to me that felt like, as you said, franchising. That was like, becoming a McDonald's or something. It's like, oh, this is popular, I'll just keep cranking this out. So one time we had this conversation when I was between books, and she said what she said to me, why don't you? And I got very huffy and artistic and was trying to explain to her, well, my dear, I said, explaining to a woman who had been in publishing for 25 years, these things don't just come out of nowhere. I have to be inspired. Because, and there's a lot of truth in that, because, that's why I couldn't do franchising. I have to love what I'm doing. This whole series, the Last King of Osten Ard, I started this in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, good, okay. I started this in 2013, and I just finished it last year. So, we're talking 11 years on one project. You don't get many of those in a lifetime, And so I have to love what I'm doing. I have to be so caring about what's going to happen, because I'm going to be doing it a really long time. And as a result, I told Deb, I can't just, and she was very much like, okay, which is deadly, which is just dead. And so I went to bed that night feeling like I haven't really convinced her. I have not convinced her. What can I tell her to make her understand how pure my artistic vision is? So I lay there in bed and I was thinking, First of all, I didn't even tell her that, it's been almost 30 years since I wrote those first books. I am a completely different person. Since then, I have been divorced, remarried, moved to England, had kids, gone through all the changes of adult life that you can go through practically, except death, which does also happen sometimes in adult life. And I hadn't gone through that. But I had gone through many other changes. And I said, how can I just write another Osten Ard book as if none of this had ever happened? And, I mean, what would that be like? I mean, if you tried to do something like that, I mean, think of it with the characters. What would happen to the characters in 30 years if you did the same amount of time? People are so different. And I thought about that for a moment. Yeah, because what would they be like? I mean, here's these two main characters. They were teenagers. They were becoming monarchs, kind of shoved into this situation, etc. And I mean, they'd obviously change a lot in 30 years. Yeah, and the other characters would change a lot in 30 years. And there'd be new characters coming along because, that's what happens in the world. And other characters would die. And people are really different as the decades roll past and they see life from a different perspective. Well, anyway, I kept talking to myself in this way. And by the time the next morning rolled around, I had spent the entire night thinking about what would happen in this world after 30 years had passed. And I woke up the next morning and I went into my wife and with, I think, really creditable kindness and honesty, I said to her, "Damn you." And that was the beginning of the new Osten Ard books, which do indeed take place roughly the same amount of time as had passed between, my writing the first set of books and the later set of books. And I do think in a lot of ways that made them a very interesting combination with the first group, because I was a 20-something-year-old man when I wrote the first group, and I was a God knows what old man, just an old man when I wrote the second set. It had a much different perspective. So.
And you needed help.
Oh, yes, I needed.
Yeah, because that is like being a first reader of The Last King of Osten Ard was one of my greatest joys ever, and I know the others who are not here because they're living in the States, it was the same. And for us, it was, Ted asked us, well, to me, these books are long gone. You tend to read them like I did read Tolkien, and I really need your help to get it all right. Would you be my first reader, my correspondence, and godmother of The Last King? For me, and we were very honored. And for me, it was really, really difficult, especially with Witchfoot Crown, which was the first one and first time to do this, when there were things that I did not like. And then there were not many, but for example, Isgrim is dying in the first few chapters, and then there's the funeral, and that's where Simon and Miriamel go to. No, it's
And
Albert's Hall. Yeah,
who attends the? Oh,
yeah.
I thought
And so they go to Albert's Hall, and then I remembered that there's one sentence in, I think it was Stone of Farewell, where Isgrimur talks about his family and his other sons besides Isorn and his daughters. And I read the funeral scene, and there were all these sons and their families, but no daughter. And I wrote, well, Ted, the daughters are missing. And he wrote back, yeah, well, they were married off to some faraway place and they couldn't make it. and then and then Ron said, oh yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And that freaking does not make sense at all. I mean, in a society like that one, of course the daughters would come back, and you have to get
You're still having the argument. I gave in.
Yeah. And then they said, Yeah, okay. You were right. I put the daughters into the funeral sales I seen, and they even have names and stuff. and reading that, then it was my proudest moment.
I would just like to say, in my own defense, that I did not advocate the sending off of one's daughters to cold waste.
Yeah, I didn't mean that.
No, I know. What I was struggling with there, as I always am, was the foreknowledge that there were going to be like 300 characters in the book. And anytime I can avoid adding any more, it feels like a good thing.
Yeah.
But I did concede. Ylva was right. It was not fair to leave the daughters out and to mention the sons, especially since one of them was inheriting the dukedom, so that would have been even more egregious dissing of the women folk. So I apologized for that and I fixed it. So can we drop it?
Now that I mentioned it publicly,
We can. My public shame.
Yeah.
But the other thing I have to mention here, because Ylva is actually, she didn't say this, but she was really shy to begin with to bring anything up with me, and especially a complaint. And whereas the other main keeper of the archives, Ron, who is a lovely guy, he's a wonderful guy. He lives in Arizona in the United States. He had been running an RPG based on the Dragonbone Chair, Osten Ard, that whole world for many years. He's a kind of an engineering guy. He's a very precise thinker and all that. And of course, translating a huge work of fiction into an RPG requires making a lot of decisions and measurements and all that kind of thing. So Ron had sat down, for instance, with my original maps, and he had figured out from my original maps how far everything was. So the first time that we got into an argument during and these are not mean, upsetting arguments. Ron is a sweetheart and a gentleman. Me, not so much, but Ron definitely. And the first time we got into a disagreement about this, Ron was kind of outraged when I told him, Ron, those are just maps that I made, I mean, it's like I didn't plan them out, and I didn't like use a compass and sextant to make sure everything was just right. It's like if you see mountains in it, that just means that there was a lot of blank space in the map. And I went, got to put something in there, and this to Ron was basically like,
heresy.
telling the Pope God is dead. Basically, it was just not something he wanted to hear. And we had a few others like that because, Ron had really worked at everything and what everything meant. And, he had explored the lore of Osten Ard in the way that when I was young, I read the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, and figured out, everything I could figure out and memorize. And another one was I had certain characters who had been just monsters in the first books. And I revealed that some of them actually, if they lived long enough, because they were not just animals, actually could learn to speak. And were more than just, and that again was another
the Hunan talking is
religious schism that almost killed Ron. It was almost like they don't talk. I hate to say this, Ron, but it is my book. I did write it. And if somebody has to make the decision, much as I respect everything you have to say, it has to be me. And it's actually important to the plot. So, but it was amazingly useful, too, to have people push back and say, this doesn't feel right for this thing that we love so much. Because one of the things you're trying to do when you're making these types of fantasy worlds and the world building that goes to making them is you are trying to create an immersive experience for the reader. You want the reader, I mean, at least that's what I want. I want them to have that reaction that I had the first time I encountered Tolkien or any number of other really fine writers of like, this is a place I can go. This is a place I can be. This is a place that I care about because it feels real and the characters feel real and the history feels like, because one of the things that brought me into fantasy in the first place was my feeling that, how in the early days of silent film, when they couldn't afford to, because the cameras were so big and heavy, they would actually have backdrops that were on rollers, and they would just go past while they, the actors would pretend to be running, and the thing's going back behind them. And for me, I'm not going to name names, but there were a lot of fantasy novels in the post-Tolkien market era, in the late 70s especially, and then into the early 80s, that felt like that. It felt like to me, it felt as though these worlds didn't exist until the story started. And once the story was resolved, and in many cases, they were like worlds where nothing had apparently happened for like thousands of years. And then all of a sudden, the bad guy shows up and goes, I am evil. I am evil. I am going to destroy this lovely place, with no kind of reason for it whatsoever. And I'm going, well, where were you for 10,000 years? I mean, were you just hoping they'd get evil on their own? Or, I mean, it struck me as, if you are a figure of complete darkness, it's just being lazy, just waiting around all that time, hoping people will curse themselves on their own. It just didn't make sense. So anyway, that was very much my feeling, is I wanted to create these immersive worlds that people could dive into. So actually writing a book with feedback from people who were, what's the word I want? Not just engaged, but are, committed to or had really loved the other books, was important for me, because one of the other reasons I didn't ever want to go back to another world. And this struck me, Ylva knows because I've told her this struck me very hard when I was working on the first book of this series. One night as I was sitting down, I suddenly realized, oh my God, Ron, Ylva, there's like a lot of people out there that feel really strongly protective and care about the first set of books, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, Dragonbone Share, etc. I said, so if I screw this up, the sequel, if I screw this up, I'm not just going to be screwing up this book. I'm going to be ruining their recollections of the earlier books as well. So I will basically be twice damned a villain. It will be very, very bad. And that was the only time I ever had a moment of panic about the books, because I felt very comfortable with the characters. I felt I knew them, the ones who were still alive and who had aged and all that. I never felt like, oh, I don't know who this character is. It's like, no, I felt that. But I realized that if I did something stupid, I was not just threatening these books, but I was threatening how people would feel and remember the other books as well.
And that is, I think, a good final word for this.
If you say so, you're the boss.